Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 149 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cebulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Whether it's choosing our outfits, dressing our hamburgers, or crafting the perfect social media post, there's one thing that tends to be at the forefront of our minds. What do these choices say about me as an individual? In the Western world, we're taught from an early age to express ourselves, learn about ourselves, and go off and discover ourselves as unique creatures. For medieval people, thinking about the self often had less emphasis on individual uniqueness and more to do with a person's relationship to other people and the world around them, both physical and spiritual. This week, I spoke with Dr. Barbara Newman about the self in the medieval world. Barbara is the John Evans Professor of Latin and a professor of English, Classics, and History at Northwestern University. She's the author of many books, including God and the Goddesses, Vision, Poetry, and Belief in the Middle Ages, Medieval Crossover, Reading the Secular Against the Sacred, and Making Love in the 12th Century. Her new book is The Permeable Self, 5 Medieval Relationships. Our conversation on ideas of the self in the Middle Ages and how others could shape and transform a person inside and out is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Barbara, for joining me to talk about The Permeable Self. This is an amazing book. You should be so proud of it. It's one of these books where you read every sentence and you kind of have to stop and think about it for a while. And I think that's wonderful. So thank you so much for coming on to talk about it.
Well, thank you for having me on the show.
It is a pleasure. So I think that we need to start at the beginning and explain to people what you mean by the permeable self. So what does this mean?
Right. Charles Taylor, in his book A Secular Age and Elsewhere, has contrasted two ways of understanding human personhood. And let's start with the modern era, since the so-called Enlightenment. He talks about the bounded or buffered self, which has strong ego boundaries, right, which is closed off from outside influences to some extent from other people, at least so it's understood. We think of individualism nowadays, and the word individual is very different from the word person. Taylor says that in the pre-modern world, especially the medieval period that I write about, the self was more porous. His word is porous, my word is permeable, means the same thing, but there were not such firm boundaries between one person and another. The term that I use for this medieval conception of personhood is coinherence, which is a term from theology, and it means literally being within one another. So I in you, you in me. And I'm interested in what happens, how the idea of the personal changes and how relationships change when we conceive of the personal as essentially the interpersonal.
Right, exactly. And the phrasing that I found in the book was that a person at this time is framing themselves through other people, right? So it's relational.
Yeah, I look at how the self is formed through other selves. And the 5 relationships I consider in the book are the relationship between teacher and student, which was much more intimate than most teacher-student relationships are today. The relationship between the pastoral counselor and the penitent in what we would now call spiritual direction. The relationship between lovers, between mother and child, not so much raising an older child, but pregnancy. How do the mother and the fetus, and then later the wet nurse and the infant relate to each other? And in the final chapter, these first 4 chapters have all been constructive ways of forming the self through the other. And in the last chapter, I look at what happens when it goes bad, at losing the self in the other, when communion becomes invasion. So I look at cases of spirit possession, the relationship between God and the devil, and the relationship between a possessed woman and her male handler, so to speak.
I think that's a good way of putting it because it implies a lot of things. And hopefully we will get to talking about that. But let's start at the beginning because you've organized this book in a way that you've said goes from maybe the least invasive to the most invasive. So I think that's a good way to structure our talk too. So let's talk about students and teachers. What was the relationship like between students and teachers? What was it supposed to be like?
Yeah, here I'm talking about really a particular period, especially the 11th and 12th centuries, what we would call the High Middle Ages, as opposed to the Late Middle Ages. So before the founding of universities, universities really changed everything. But before that, there were cathedral schools. And the model of teaching that was favored in these cathedral schools was what Stephen Jager has called charismatic teaching. And I pick up that term from him, from his wonderful book, The Envy of Angels. In charismatic teaching, the teacher is not simply someone who imparts information or teaches skills or disperses knowledge. And this is very much a male system, this is about masters and boys. He is someone who is a model to be imitated. And above all, the goal of the student is to become a living copy of the master, right? To become like the teacher. And certainly this involves moral formation. The curriculum is understood in terms of literae et mores, which means literature or letters and manners. Mores is hard to translate. It can be translated either manners or morals. And I see it as a world in which manners are morals. Your way of comportment in the world was so important. Physical presence was everything. And so acquiring virtue in education was a matter of imitating the virtues and the manners of your teacher, both his ethical conduct, but also the way he carried himself, the way he walked, the way he talked, his self-restraint, his etiquette. And this relationship could begin at any age, often around the age of 7, when a boy was sent off to begin his education. These were boarding schools. The child left his family and lived with the teacher at the school with other boys. And the relationship could last for anywhere from a few years to 10 years or more. And often the exchange of letters between a master and his old boys would be much more intimate than the letters between the child and his parents.
Mm-hmm. This isn't just rhetoric, is it? It's meant to be a better or a tighter relationship than that of a boy and his parents, isn't it?
Yeah, and one well-known teacher said, from our fathers, we receive our raw being. From our teachers, we receive being wise, which is greater. And therefore, teachers should be loved more than parents. So very, very different from the way we conceive of teaching nowadays.
I think about that having been a teacher, it would be strange for someone in your classroom to start to imitate the way that you speak or hold yourself.
We wouldn't like it. No, we wouldn't like it at all. But I use the example of some places in our culture where we still have charismatic teaching. And I think of, for example, music lessons, martial arts, yoga, dance, where you really do imitate the teacher's moves. The teacher plays a piece on the violin and the student tries to play the piece the same way. Or the yoga teacher models some postures and the student tries to imitate those postures. I think we have an easier way of understanding this in terms of physical skills than we do of academic skills or morality. But it was the same model that in the early Middle Ages was applied to philosophy or theology or rhetoric, as well as music and athletics.
Yeah, I think it still exists in some ways. It's occurring to me as you're speaking that we still have that in some ways where you're supposed to fake it till you make it when you're trying to look like the job that you want, right? Look like the success that you want. And one of the things you talk about in the book is how this imitation of ethics and morals, but also bearing, is related to aristocracy and giving the child the best chance in their career. So, can you tell us a little bit about that relationship?
Yeah, this is an elite system of education. It is not for the masses. There was no effort at education for the masses. And these boys were training for careers in the church and to some extent in secular courts, where they would belong to many of them became bishops or abbots or high-ranking churchmen. Others were in the entourage of a bishop or of a king. And the skills that they learn as schoolboys translate into the political skills that they will need as adults within a very hierarchical system.
Yeah. So even if you're lucky enough to be a boy who maybe has a scholarship or something to go to this school, you still want to act like you're elite so that you have the best chance in the future.
Yeah, and these schools did produce young men who went on to significant careers, both in secular society and in the church.
Yeah.
So it was a system, we might say, of the self-reproduction of the elite, and it worked. But there were also critiques of the system. Nowadays, we would look at a master like this and say, ooh, personality cult, not good. There
Yes.
were people who said that at the time. And an interesting case is Peter Abelard, the great philosopher, who himself had a huge personality cult around him. But he objected to this system because he said, what should matter is not the love of a teacher or eloquent words. What should matter is the substantive truth of arguments. So you have to look at the meaning of words, not just at the beautiful surface and the affection that they express. And he got in trouble for this. Abelard was getting in trouble for everything all
Yeah.
the time.
For everything, exactly. But that is a good place to seg because talking about the surface and imitating the surface, but also ideas, brings us into your next level of this permeability, which is where you're talking about saints and sinners. And a lot of the focus on this chapter is talking about telepathy, how
Yes.
saints and mystics and Jesus and also biblical figures can actually read minds. So how does this work in culture in the Middle Ages?
Yeah, telepathy is a really interesting phenomenon. It has been attested in many cultures, many historical periods. Every now and then, there's a movement of, psychic research or something like this to study it. But it shows up particularly in religious contexts. If you read the Gospels, all four of them represent Jesus as someone who was very skilled at reading people's minds. For instance, when he met a guy named Nathaniel for the first time, he said to Nathaniel, look, an Israelite in whom there is no guile. And Nathaniel says, what? How do you know me? Jesus says, oh, I saw you sitting under the fig tree over there. Okay. But Jesus knows when people are skeptical about him, when people are envious, when people have strong faith, when he performs miracles of healing, what he usually says is, your faith has made you whole. And so he can tell when people have faith or when they don't. And the model of Jesus as a mind reader translated into many medieval saints, because of course the essence of sainthood is imitating Christ,
Mhm.
right? And we think of imitating Christ in his poverty, in his preaching, in his life of austerity, in miracle working, in healing. But another way that some medieval saints, not all of them, imitated Jesus was in reading minds. And this especially shows up in the context of pastoral counseling, spiritual direction. What I find especially interesting is it's not priests who do this. priests were entrusted after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Priests were invested with the power of hearing confessions and performing sacramental absolution, and everyone had to go to confession at least once a year. In this period, you don't read about priests reading people's minds. You read about holy women who did it, and sometimes lay brothers, holy men who were not monks, but who were kind of attached as laborers to monasteries. And a few of them had this power too. So they would have, clients who would come to them for spiritual direction. And suppose the client is just too ashamed to say, I slept with the priest again, or, I have to say, I've just been tempted to blaspheme. I say all kinds of horrible things about God, or I don't really believe in the Eucharist, or I've been practicing usury. I lend out money at interest, which is a terrible sin. And when the client or the penitent was ashamed to confess these sins, the counselor, not everyone, but particularly holy women and men, would say, I know that you have done such and such and such. Don't worry, God will forgive you, but you must confess it. You must go to a priest and confess it, and you must change your ways. You must give up this sin. Never do it again. I think that one way that this functioned was to cast a kind of glamour around the sacrament of confession, because it's parallel to Eucharistic miracles, where if visions of the bleeding Christ child appear in the host, that proves that the consecrated host really is the body of Christ. Similarly, if a charismatically gifted saint can read the mind of a penitent at confession, that proves that this sacrament really is something holy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an interesting place to think about this stuff, because reading a lot about monks, which is something I had to do for my last book, you weren't supposed to out people about their sins. You're not supposed to out them, but mystics will do it, and that's fine. So it's kind of an interesting place to think about, because people are supposed to confess their own sins. And it's interesting when you have a mystic that will read someone's mind and then say you still have to confess it yourself.
Yeah, and you mentioned not outing people for their sins. Those who did this were persons possessed by demons, because demoniacs, possessed people, are constantly serving as kind of negative parodies of the saints. So the powers that the saints have through God, possessed people have through the devil. And they could also do it. And there was actually a kind of practice in some places where it was known that there was a demoniac, a man or woman who had a demon, and people wanted to know, so who was it that committed adultery with my wife and fathered my illegitimate child? Or who stole that money? They would go to the demoniac and ask, and this person would say, because the demon knew, but as soon as the person confessed the sin, then it was wiped out of the books and the demon would no longer be able to remember it. And so even the demoniacs put the fear of God into people.
That was something that I thought was really interesting. I don't think we have time to spend a lot of time on it, but the idea of God forgetting a sin or demons forgetting a sin as soon as it's confessed. That's interesting to me, is the slate being so wiped clean that nobody remembers your sin at all.
Not even God.
Not even God. But this brings me to the idea of telepathy. I think in the modern world, when we think about telepathy, it's one-to-one. It's one person reading another person's mind. But what you're getting at here, and something you really expand on in the book, is that this is triangulated in the Middle Ages, right? How does that work?
Yes, it's triangulated through the mind of God, because it wouldn't be you reading my mind directly. But if you are a holy person and you live habitually in the presence of God through prayer, you would have the power of seeing other minds within the mind of God. And that's how it worked. And this is why some of the church fathers, like Augustine and Gregory the Great, said there would be perfect telepathy in heaven, because everyone would see directly into the mind of God, and there would be no sin to close us off from each other. Dante's Paradiso is wonderful in this way because Beatrice and all the other saints in paradise can read the pilgrim Dante's mind, and they know what questions he wants to ask before he asks them. And this is seen as something that expands the joy of all the blessed in paradise.
Yeah, I think that model is really kind of the heart of this idea of the permeable self. Everyone is one person in God's mind, and we can upload and download stuff from it.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. Right. So each in all, because all in God. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I want to circle back around to the holy ideas of this, but I do want to get through each of your chapters, give people a taste of the book. So let's move on for a second to the next chapter, which talks about lovers. I think this is something that is really familiar to us, the idea of lovers exchanging hearts. So tell us about the exchange of hearts in love, especially courtly love at this time.
Yeah. This is a really interesting motif for a couple of reasons. One is that it's one place where we see secular literature really influencing religious literature, and it's definitely the secular literature that comes first. The other way I think it's interesting is that it starts as purely a metaphor that becomes more and more a literal thing, an actual practice as we go through the later corpus of literature. But the basic idea is when two lovers in a romance have to part, suppose that the man is going on a crusade, suppose the woman's husband has discovered that she has a lover and has sent him away. For some reason, they have to part. And so their last night together, they kiss, and then they say, and I give you my heart will go with you. And then the lady says, and yours will remain with me. And the topos here is from this point on, it's the man's heart that keeps the woman alive, and her heart keeps him alive. So although they are separate, and remember, they could not Zoom, they could not email, they couldn't text each other, and even writing a letter was a very iffy thing and might take months and months, and it might arrive or it might not. So parting was a major thing. And this was the glue. This was the cement that kept the two one, even though they went their separate ways and might not be able to contact each other for years on end. And you see how when one lover is perhaps unfaithful, the other lover pines away because the heart that is keeping her alive or keeping him alive is no longer functioning, right? And sometimes it has a comic ending, when two lovers meet again, one says, and tell me how my heart is doing. Oh, it's just fine, how is yours? So this is a very common motif in romance. I've found it in French romances, Occitan, German, English. It's really all over the place. And about the middle of the 13th century, you begin to see a sacred adaptation of this, where women mystics begin to exchange their hearts with Jesus. And then Jesus becomes like the courtly lover, right? There's a famous passage in Catherine of Siena where St. Catherine tells her confessor one fine day, I no longer have a heart in my body because Jesus came and took it. He says, yeah, right, very funny, Catherine. She goes, no, really, I have no heart. And then a few days later, Jesus comes back in another vision and gives Catherine his own heart. And she says, from then on, all her life is directed by the heart of Jesus. Right? Mm-hmm. And when Raymond of Capua, her confessor, is writing her Vita, her saint's life, he says, to prove that this is a real physical thing, that her friends swore they saw the incision on her breast from the divine surgery where Jesus exchanged their hearts.
Yes, I think that's essential to mention because people are always skeptical in the Middle Ages, just like today, and they're always like, where is the proof? Come on now. I
Yeah.
think you have one image in the book that is so cute. It's just Jesus looking so happy, just like, here you go. He's just reaching in, passing his heart over to Catherine.
Yeah, it's yours. It's yours if you want it. Yeah, and I think it's an important point about skepticism because some people think of medieval people as very credulous, as superstitious, eager to believe anything. But no, people are people. When strange miracles like this were reported, hagiographers expected skepticism and would try to say, here is the eyewitness evidence, here is the proof. X, Y, and Z were all witnesses of this miracle, and they're all trustworthy people, and they all swear that this happened and they saw it with their own eyes.
Yeah, exactly. You see that all over the place. And again, we're going to come back to the holy stuff, but I wanted to ask you a question about the lovers before we move on. And that is, so this is happening at a time when aristocratic marriages are the ones that are arranged most often. And so
Yes.
someone is going to be married and their heart might be somewhere else. So do you think that this idea of having a separate heart from a functioning body comes from this idea of separation in actual physical space, or you think it comes from separation in emotional space, or a little bit of both, perhaps?
A little bit of both. Yes, there are some romances that end with the lovers getting married, but there are others that are about adultery, where the lover is the obstacle or the husband is the obstacle to the love affair. Aristocratic marriage was not about love. It was far too important to be left to the couples. It was the marriage of thief to fief, right?
Yes.
And so marriage was arranged. And this is certainly one of the many well springs of courtly love, that if you wanted to love a union based on what we now think of as romance or erotic love, it would generally be outside of marriage. I don't know any texts that talk about an exchange of hearts between husband and wife.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is telling. I think that's telling in a lot
Yeah,
of ways.
well, come to think of it, there is Chrétien de Troyes' romance of Yvain, The Night with the Lion.
Mhm.
And there is an exchange of hearts between the husband and the wife whom he has just met. He kills her first husband, then he marries her, then he immediately goes off fighting tournaments for a year and forgets all about her. So he has her heart, but he has forgotten her. And so the relationship just goes tragically bad.
That's true. He has a relationship with a lion instead.
Yes, yes, the lion is a much closer partner to him.
Well, one of the things I was thinking about is, again, looking at monastic treaties and stuff like that, you have people talking about the idea of love coming to you through the eyes. So you are very, very vulnerable to things that you see having an effect on you. We talked about this a little bit with Anne Marie Rasmussen about the kind of holding
Mm.
up a badge in a church and getting that, downloading that that holy stuff onto your badge by holding it up, the idea of vision. And this is something that you get at in your next chapter, especially when you're talking about pregnancy. So we were talking on the podcast a couple weeks ago about the distaff gospels and the way that pregnant women are especially vulnerable to being permeable when it comes to the environment. So let's talk about pregnancy for a minute. What was interesting about pregnancy and how this works in terms of permeability when you were writing this?
Yeah, permeability, especially through the eye, as you say, people often fall in love at first sight and describe this as the arrows of love being shot by Cupid or by the beloved lady through the eye. And so love comes in at the eye. But also, pregnant women were thought to have an extraordinary influence on the fetus for life. And that could work through the woman's imagination. There was a belief that whatever the woman happens to be looking at the moment of conception is going to imprint its image on the fetus. So don't have images of animals hanging on your walls. Don't have monstrous grotesques, or you might give birth to one if you happen to cast your eyes on it at just the wrong moment. Or cravings. We all know pregnant women have certain food cravings, and those are thought, on the one hand, to indicate whether you're carrying a boy or a girl, for example. But if you crave, say, strawberries and you eat a lot of strawberries, your fetus could have strawberry birthmarks or something like that. Mm. So a pregnant woman had to take incredible care of herself. She was supposed to avoid any upsetting emotions, try to keep stress down. We still say this. Avoid occasions for fear, for anger, try not to get upset about too much about anything. Avoid difficult labor, physical labor like field work that could cause a miscarriage. And when we read this sort of thing, we say, okay, this has got to be only for elite women, because certainly peasant women didn't have the luxury of sitting in a sedan chair throughout their pregnancy and avoiding hard labor or emotional upsets. But it's fascinating the way the relationship between the fetus, who is conceived very much as a person, and the expected mother just seem to deeply, deeply influence each other in all kinds of ways.
Mm-hmm. I went to a conference a few years ago. It was a medical conference that was themed around zombies. And there was a person named Dr. Amy Boddy who was talking about the influence of placentas on mothers and whether the placenta and through it the baby is having an influence on the mother, so that it's driving the mother's behavior as a mom bee. That was part of the title of her talk. And it's interesting to see this idea in the Middle Ages as well, about the baby having some influence over the mother, just as the mother does over the baby.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Another way, as I said, you see this influence often in attempts to predict the sex of the child, which everybody was interested in. So, for instance, if the expected mother wanted to watch jousts at tournaments, it was a sure sign she was carrying a boy. And if she wanted to dance and listen to music, then she was carrying a girl. And these are elite gender roles, and that they're thought to be inborn in the child, and so to influence the mother.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that you talk about also is the medical theories about this, and how, if you think of it one way, there's the two-seed theory, which is Galenic, and then you have the one that's Aristotelian, meaning the baby is made from polluted blood, which is the menses. So right. This baby is also kind of permeable in that it's taking on kind of the innocence of being a baby, but also original sin, and also the sins of the mother through the menses. So how is this working medically for pregnancy?
Yeah, well, I should say there that Galen and Aristotle famously had different views on this. Galen thought that both parents contributed what we would now call genetic material. He didn't know about the egg, but female sperm, which is basically the same thing. Whereas Aristotle thought that only the male contributed what he called the form of the child, and the mother, through her menstrual blood, provided the matter. And medieval writers talking about this would sometimes take two different views. The same writer in philosophical writings would follow Aristotle, and in medical writings would follow Galen. And so there were a number of views. Neither view definitively triumphed over the other. But you mention the role of original sin, and that is an important thing. The body, of course, is polluted by the menstrual blood from which the body of the infant is literally formed, but also the child inherits original sin. And this could become a very tragic thing if a mother died in labor and the fetus, of course, was unbaptized, and therefore that mother could not be buried in consecrated ground, because the unbaptized infant would pollute it. And so a practice developed from the early 13th century on of conducting post-mortem C-sections on mothers who died in labor, just so the mother could be buried in the church cemetery. And if the fetus was even a little bit alive for just a few instants, the midwife was supposed to perform emergency baptism on that infant. And even if it died 5 minutes later, that still made an eternal difference between salvation and damnation for that little stillborn baby. So it was a major thing.
Yeah, and it's an interesting intersection of theory and practice because archaeological records suggest that this didn't happen all the time, that sometimes people would bury a woman who was pregnant with the fetus still within her, because that is a very difficult thing, a choice to make when you have death in the birthing room. So it's a very interesting place, I think, that intersection between death and birth, and that's something that you talk a lot about in the book too.
Yeah, Burkhard of Worms, a writer of canon law around the turn of the millennium, denounces a lay practice of burying a mother who died in childbirth with a stake through her womb, where there was apparently a fear that the soul of that fetus would return as a vampire or a ghost. So here is this really creepy practice.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, in the later Middle Ages, parents of stillborn babies were so desperate to bury them in consecrated ground that at least one church put a wall around its cemetery and locked the gate at night so that people couldn't sneak in by night to conduct clandestine burials of infants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't think about that instance without tears. So this might
Yeah,
be a good opportunity to talk about wet nurses.
I know. No, it's pretty creepy.
Well, I think it just goes to show that love that parents have for their children and just trying to give them the best eternal life that they possibly could. But we
That's
should talk
right.
about wet nurses. Before I start to cry, we should talk about wet nurses. So this is something that I did talk about with Adrienne Williams Boyarin about Jewish and Christian wet nurses and how the wet nurse can really influence the baby. So can you give us some information on how this works in your book?
Sure. Wet nurses, okay, first of all, very, very few mothers, except really poor ones, nurse their own babies. And the reason for this was that you can't sustain pregnancy and nursing at the same time. The medical reason for this, according to medieval doctors, was that breast milk is processed blood, that the menses are turned into breast milk to nurse a baby. And if a second pregnancy occurs, then the milk will dry up. And it is true that the milk will dry up if you get pregnant again. And the only way to avoid getting pregnant with no reliable birth control, and the church fiercely opposed to it anyway, was prolonged abstinence. And married couples didn't want to abstain from sex for the 2 years or so that it took to nurse a baby. And so, in order to prevent starving the baby when the milk dried up, they would put the baby out to wet nurse. But there were tremendous social anxieties around nursing because it was believed and had been believed since antiquity that the wet nurse's milk would deeply influence the fetus, just as maternal influences in the womb would influence it, so would the milk that it sucked. And so it was important to get a nurse who was healthy, who was of good character, and who was of the right religion. And here's the question you ask. Apparently, there were some Christian families who hired Jewish wet nurses, especially in the Ashkenaz territories. And I think that the reverse maybe happened as well. I'm not so sure. But it was thought that if Jewish families hire Christian nurses and the Christian wet nurse receives communion at Easter, this was something that was anathema to the Jewish families, because for them, the Eucharist was some kind of idolatrous sacrifice. And the wet nurse could convey that sort of forbidden element to the infant in her milk. And so this may or may not have actually happened, but there was supposedly a rule that the Christian nurse for the week after Easter had to express her milk into the latrine before she could feed it to the Jewish child so that the child shouldn't be contaminated. And then conversely, there was some worry that a Jewish baby with a Christian nurse should be protected from the nurse eating pork or shellfish or any other forbidden food. So the Christian nurse who was nursing a Jewish baby had, in effect, to keep kosher while she was doing that. So there was a sense that the actual religion of the nurse could influence the child, and both Jews and Christians were really worried about this.
Mm-hmm. Again, this is one of those places where you kind of wish for a time machine, or at least I do, because there are these rules about that. And at the same time, we know that there are also bans about Christians were not supposed to have Jewish wet nurses. And we know from Adrian Williams Boyarin's work that people just ran roughshod over those rules too. So, you'd want to go and interview some people from back in the day and ask them what their practices were.
Yeah, it would. I mean, because the evidence we have is so spotty and it's all prescriptive. It's not descriptive. It's not actual people on the ground and what they were doing.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so I want to be mindful of your time, but I do want to get to this last section of your book, which is God and the devil and how they might influence people. So a few weeks ago, I talked with Renate Blumenfeld-Kaczynski about Martyrdom and about how the demons were attacking her. You have some other cases in here. So can you tell us how that worked, how God and the devil might influence people through permeability?
Yeah. If human beings are permeable to each other in some of the ways we've talked about already, all the more are they permeable to spirits, to the Holy Spirit, but also to evil spirits, to demons. So every Christian was supposed to have the Holy Spirit, which is received in baptism and in the sacrament of confirmation. And the Holy Spirit dwells in the heart and, guides that person's faith and actions, but also demons were constantly harassing people and trying to possess them. And one of the things you see from the late Middle Ages, and especially in the early modern period, is a great increase in both the number of cases of possession and how dramatic and theatrical these cases became. One of the phenomena that I write about in my last chapter, and this is truly weird, is a new category of sainthood, which I call demonic martyrdom. And this is the category where a person, I describe the case of one man, Cistercian abbot, Richelm of Schöntal, very strange guy, but the great majority of these people were women who were just constantly harassed by demons. Poor Hermine of Rouen was one of them. Another was a woman near Cologne named Christine of Stommeln. There are several others later on. There are Italian ones. These women were just tortured. Demons would appear to them either visibly or invisibly. They would beat them up. They would hear terrible voices in their ears, accusing them of things, tempting them to heresy, to blasphemy. When Christine of Stommeln wanted to receive communion, she said the demons created the illusion of fire all around the priest and all over the church. So she couldn't dare approach communion because it looked as if she would catch on fire. She came up with astonishing things. Demons would take her up into a tree and throw her out of the branches. They would pull the teeth out of her mouth. There is a really, truly horrible case where she claimed that the devils hurled human excrement at her constantly. And Peter of Dacia, her probably half crazed, her hagiographer, who was far too credulous, claimed that he had been an eyewitness and had himself been spattered by shit thrown by the demons. So you would think, nowadays we would say, well, clearly these people are mentally ill. Now, the category of mental illness did exist in the Middle Ages, and there were many, many people then who would have said, that this person has amencia or what other mania, whatever term they used for the particular mental illness. But there were some who thought, no, this is a chosen bride of God. And because God always wants his saints to be tested by affliction, he is allowing his bride to be tested by these demons. And so the more firmly she maintains her faith and love of God, even though she experiences nothing but tortures from demons day and night for years on end, the more holy she is. And so you get this category of saints who are not said to be possessed, although they look very much like possessed women, who are instead seen as martyrs of the demons. And they were very controversial because there were people like Jean Gerson, who was a pioneer in the art called the discernment of spirits, who totally rejected the category that these were holy people. But this is not holy, this is mental illness. But others thought that they were worthy of reverence.
Yeah. And one of the things that I don't think Jean Gerson mentions when he's talking about Hermine is that the influence of the handler, as you talked about before, might have had a lot to do with it. He's too respectful of these priests or brothers who are handling these women. He doesn't really suggest that maybe they had an influence, but you suggest that they might have had an influence.
Well, yes. Hermine, she was if you've heard the podcast with Renata Blumenfeld-Kosinski, you know about Hermine. She was a peasant woman. She lived at the time of the Black Death, which was probably why she married a man much, much older than she was. He died. She was left alone. She moved from her rural village to Reims, and there she fell under the influence of a confessor called Jean le Graveur, who was an Augustinian. And Jean le Graveur probably wanted to have the spiritual distinction of fashioning a saint, being the spiritual director of a saint. And so he put poor Hermine on a kind of penitential regimen where she was supposed to fast strictly. He gave her lodgings in an almshouse attached to his priory. And above all, she was supposed to be strictly obedient to him as her confessor and tell him everything that happened to her. And it's clear from her so-called visions, she longed to go back to her village where her friends and relatives were really trying hard to get her to come home. Mm-hmm. But he said, no, you have vowed the way of God, you should be faithful. And so she tried to be faithful, and she slowly went out of her mind and became more and more tortured by demons. It took animal forms. She had this whole, Renata calls it this whole demonic zoo of toads and serpents and bears and whatnot, all these animals that tortured her. She had sexual temptations. She was bruised by the demons. She was tempted to jump out her window. I think if you read her account, you can see that she was attempting suicide over and over again, but she didn't think that was what was happening. She thought that the demons were inflicting all these bruises on her. And I don't think Jean le Graveur had consciously evil intentions. I don't think he was trying to destroy her. I think he was trying to make her holy. But the result, I think, was that he destroyed her. She was not literate. She couldn't even read a book of hours. She couldn't follow all the Latin prayers that she spent hours listening to. And she lost it. And, fortunately, after only 10 months of this, she caught the plague herself and died of it, which isn't much of a happy ending, but what other kind of fate would there have been for her?
Yeah, she didn't really have another one. And this is a cautionary tale, I think, in the theme of all the other things you talked about in the book of leaving yourself open or having someone else leave you open to all of these dangerous things. It's something that I think people would be worried about back in the day, are still worried about today. And we're not going to have time to get into your whole last chapter, your concluding chapter, which I think is one of the most valuable of the whole thing, where you talk about how there are implications for today and research today on how these things worked in the Middle Ages. And we are totally on board the same train when we're talking about understanding the Middle Ages is part of the key to understanding cultural difference today. If you can apply that thinking to a culture that is long ago, you can apply that thinking to other cultures today. And one of the things you talk about is different theories of mind. And it's just an amazing chapter that we don't have time for. So I think everyone's going to have to read the book.
Well, thank you. I hope they do. Danièle, it's been wonderful to talk with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for coming on, Barbara. To find out more about Barbara's work, you can visit her faculty webpage at english.northwestern.edu/people/faculty/Newman-Barbara.html. Her new book is The Permeable Self, 5 Medieval Relationships. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. Well, I've been working on this project for a bit. I've told you about it before, and I'm going to be doing year in reviews for every year of the Middle Ages.
That is a big project. Where are you going to start?
I'm going to start on the year 1000. So what I've been thinking about, and with it for a long time, is I wanted to kind of present history where time is kind of conveyed as in motion. We always kind of happen to see things as a big blob. Like the Middle Ages is a big blob where, Genghis Khan and Joan of Arc are somehow living side by side and could have talked to each other, which isn't quite the case.
Well, I guess Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
That's true. Like Bill and Ted, they bring everybody together. I want to kind of convey that things are happening all the time, in even like on a yearly basis, things change. So, we'll start with the year 1000. I think that's a nice date to start with. And my idea for the first bit is to kind of work my way forward. So you'll see like year in review 1000, and in a couple of days, year in review 1001, and kind of talking about some of the important events that happen throughout the world. So it will even go beyond where we do the Eurasian continent, where we'll talk about what's happening in the Americas or Oceanic region, where we know certain dates. And so it's a lot easier of that to know what's happening in Europe or medieval China. There's quite a lot of events that happen, but I'm going to try and make a bit of a world history. And my goal is to get through the 100 years by the end of this year. Hopefully I can do that.
You are nothing if not ambitious.
And then at some point, I'll start working my way backwards as well. So go 999 and downwards. So I hope people enjoy it. I hope it'll be a series that people will like and want to follow through from year to year. And otherwise, I'm going to try and get several years in a row done over like a 1 week period so people can see what we're going at. And the year 1000 is a great place to start.
So when are you planning to launch this?
Hopefully around the time this episode comes out. You'll see that's the plan. I've got a whole bunch of other little writing projects that I'm trying to get going, as well as we've got always these tons of authors that are contributing. We're trying to throw out loads and loads of content.
That's good. It's good to have ambition. So we will all keep our eyes peeled for your new project. Hopefully it will be dropping soon.
Indeed.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.
Thank you, as always, to all of medievalist.net's patrons on patreon.com for your support each month. Patrons can access amazing stuff like subscriptions to Medieval Warfare magazine and the Medieval magazine, a book club, and exclusive maps of the medieval world by Tina Ross. Your support helps medievalist.net's podcasters to keep bringing you fun and educational historical content, including this very podcast. So thank you. For all the details, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from selves to elves, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cebulski, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.